Mental health is undoubtedly one of the most prominent topics of discussion on the internet, and it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, who could disagree with breaking the stigma of mental health and educating the masses on issues that genuinely impact a large group of people? Well, unfortunately for everyone, every large issue like this comes with nuance. The topics I will be discussing today are rather controversial and come from a place of opinion. I would like to state now that I am not a mental health professional, and my viewpoints are limited, but I do have some experience coming from my time working as a psychometric tester. This is intended to be a conversation, and I am interested in learning more from everyone watching this. So please, if there is something that I say that you disagree with, write a comment detailing your viewpoint. I would like to begin by saying that both of my parents are psychologists, and discussions of mental health were highly commonplace in my home all throughout my childhood. One of the most important things that I have learned about mental health through discussions with my parents is that any disorder and the field of mental health itself is not a monolith. All patients are different, and despite carrying similar diagnoses, patients are all treated in a way that is entirely unique. Something that is rarely talked about in the mental health community is that misdiagnoses and re-diagnoses are extremely common. In my time doing psych testing, I encountered patients coming in for a second, third, and even fourth opinion, sometimes receiving a different diagnosis every time. Mental health is complicated and not always clear even to professionals with decades of experience. This is why we have testing instruments that can assist in accurate and effective diagnosis. I will go more in depth on this later. I would also like to preface this discussion by saying that I will be abiding by a strict definition of mental health disorders, qualified by a significant negative impact on a patient's normal functioning. My motivation for talking about this largely comes from my time working as a psychometrist, which is a paraprofessional position where someone like myself administers testing instruments like the COG, Achieve, and CBT to patients looking to figure out their mental health situations. I would see patients in blocks of 2 hours, asking them lots and lots of questions, often getting highly personal. These answers, scores, and behavioral observations would be sent to the psychologist, who would interpret them and ultimately determine a diagnosis. Working clinically is genuinely eye-opening. As someone who predominantly worked with children and teenagers, even just seeing how parents treated their children was genuinely life-changing for me. I learned to appreciate all that had been given to me and the healthy relationship that I maintain with my parents. I learned the inner workings of mental health care as a governmental institution and as a business. I learned how insurance works and how decisions are made about who gets care and for how much money. I will be applying these experiences to the discussions today, and I will do my best to explain the complex topics. But again, I am not a professional, and my viewpoint on mental health policy is limited. A different part of psych testing that genuinely changed the way that I viewed the world was the way that patients differed in their approaches to mental health. Many people came in with a referral or by mandate, which often simplified the process, as they just wanted to get their testing over with and get their report ASAP. But some people came in with an entirely different agenda. Many teenagers and adults came in with a presupposed diagnosis, even telling me things like, "Oh, I just need to get my ADHD medication," or "I'm so bipolar, my moods are so volatile." These were curious cases to me, as they clearly had done their homework, and they knew the qualities of their respective presupposed diagnoses, which were often in plurality. But these cases were also worrisome, as they may be subconsciously or even intentionally endorsing symptoms that were not based in reality. Often called med student syndrome, awareness of medical information often leads to the imposition of those qualities onto the self, even when they're not really there. I began to hear stories from other testers about their patients malingering or over-exaggerating their symptoms. We can often see when this is occurring through built-in systems that are flagged by exaggerated endorsement, usually to an extreme. This, however, is not what I would like to discuss today. There is a difference between malingering and self-diagnosis, which concerns me the most. Malingerers are usually aware of their exaggerations, and they usually have an alternative motive for diagnosis. This could be stipends from the government or other forms of care. Self-diagnosis, however, is usually a misinterpretation of existing symptoms in oneself. health. This is far more dangerous, in my opinion, and may ultimately lead to the deterioration of mental health as a science. Experiences that I generally associate with these self-diagnoses are patients that come in with laundry lists of self-imposed disorders without any official diagnoses, patients that fight the psychologist on grounds of diagnosis or non-diagnosis, and patients who hop from psychologist to psychologist until they find one that will give them their desired diagnosis. On the internet, we often see infographics discussing social justice topics or political news, but in recent years, mental health has become a prominent topic of discussion on these infographics. They may seem like a small part of internet culture, but a shocking number of people actually get their news from social media. So social media infographics are actually a major component of what influences the opinions of young people, whether we like it or not. Although infographics are great for distributing bite-sized chunks of information, discussions of mental health, especially infographics discussing symptoms of autism or symptoms of ADHD, etc., are far too limited to be effective. If the problem were a lack of information, I would not be sitting here today. The problem with these consumable snippets of information is the illusion that they paint a complete picture. When these infographics cite sources like DSM-5, the information is viewed as fact and therefore sufficient to be used practically. The problem with this thinking is that information about mental health without the experience to complement it is actually more dangerous than helpful. People are easily able to apply short bulleted lists of symptoms to themselves and others, and due to the reliability of the source, they are believed to be educated opinions. This is how patients grow to believe that they can self-diagnose. The problem was never misinformation, it was misinterpretation. On other platforms such as TikTok, people will frequently create POV videos about their ADHD, autism, or even DID. These videos are intentionally made to be relatable for other people in the community. But by making these broad strokes and jokes about real symptoms, people who do not actually have these disorders may find this content to be all too relatable. For some, this is a wake-up call to get tested and may actually be highly beneficial. But for most, this creates self-doubt and may lead people to self-diagnose or seek unnecessary care. A great example of this issue is the conversation about executive dysfunction. Executive dysfunction is a symptom characteristic of ADHD and autism. But based on its description, most people listening right now would be able to relate to it. The way it's represented on social media like TikTok and YouTube is with examples like the classic, "Ugh, I want to get up and do something so bad, but my brain just won't let me do it." This failure to execute tasks, to be productive, or even just a functioning human is familiar to most everyone. Personally, I can think of a million times that I've gotten anxiety because I want to do something, but the part of my brain that makes me get up and do it is stopping me. Now you may be wondering, is this or is this not executive dysfunction? And the truth is that yes, it is, but that doesn't mean that I have ADHD. I would next like to address the discussions of mental health on Twitter. This will be one of the more controversial discussions, so please comment your thoughts if you feel I have misrepresented the reality of this situation. Twitter is one of the most influential social media platforms in existence. This is in part due to the anonymity of the culture. On Twitter, misinformation thrives. Echo chambers exist as obligatory groupthink norms. A problem arises when a platform with such gravity is able to suppress healthy conversation of controversial topics like mental health. Twitter has popularized the term neurodivergent as a way of categorizing specific diagnoses together. Usually these are identified by a sense of permanence or being hardwired in a certain way. Because of this definition, this term includes people with ADHD, autism, and a select few other disorders. Those who fall into the neurodivergent box are often able to find community on Twitter. This is a great thing until the echo chamber starts making changes in policy based solely on the neurodivergent experience. To better explain this, I will be discussing the term normalization. I am not using this in any way to other those who identify as neurodivergent, but instead to discuss how normalization of mental illness is actually harmful to those who have those mental illnesses. Those with autism do in fact need special care most of the time. This is fact. By characterizing autism as entirely normal, you erase the necessity of care. This may sound purely hypothetical, but these effects are taking place in reality. Insurance companies will back off coverage of autism treatment. Although it's true that we shouldn't try to fix neurodivergent people, we need to recognize that they need care and allow this to be provided to them. Let's talk for a moment about the DSM. If you are unfamiliar, the DSM is a professional reference book that lists all mental health disorders that can be used in medical documentation. documentation. The DSM also provides information about each disorder, but it's important to remember that symptom identification and professional experience do not equate. I wanted to mention this to specifically address the argument that if someone reads the DSM, they are an expert on said disorder, or have some higher authority to self-diagnose. While the information in the DSM is the official description of the disorder, it takes tremendous amounts of clinical experience to diagnose. Even people with a PhD still need supervision from a more experienced psychologist in order for the diagnosis to be valid. Now that we have discussed the ways in which the internet impacts mental health discussions, let's talk about why any of this matters. Well, with self-diagnosis being validated by social media culture, this directly undermines the authority and expertise of a mental health professional. Patients may resist the diagnosis and opinions of an expert if it contradicts their presupposed diagnoses. At the end of the day, the job of a mental health professional is to provide an accurate diagnosis and care to a patient, not validate their presupposed diagnoses and their feelings. It would be unethical to ignore scientific, tried and true methods of diagnosis in order to satisfy a customer. Another concern is that sometimes a patient is able to convince a psychologist of a phantom disorder, and the patient may receive unnecessary, incorrect, and potentially harmful treatment. As a psych tester, I am aware of ways to spot when a patient is overly endorsing symptoms. There are checks in place to avoid misdiagnosis, but in some cases, the options are either to ignore the patient's claims or believe their highly unlikely endorsements to be based in fact. Unfortunately, most of the time, patients are unknowingly endorsing their symptoms, as they genuinely believe their mental health to be at a highly unlikely severity. This often shrouds the patient's actual problem and further postpones the most effective treatment options. Although it seems like mental health is becoming a more prevalent conversation and overall destigmatizing the issue, many may be surprised to hear we are running out of mental health professionals. False expertise on the internet has lowered the value of a real mental health education, simply because many feel like they would rather create a false explanation of their imperfect human experience than be told that nothing is wrong and life is hard. In a world that diagnoses without the need for a professional, expertise becomes obsolete. But what can we do to fix this before mental health as a profession is destroyed beyond repair? We can start by trusting the professionals. People with real clinical experience are more likely to provide an accurate diagnosis and a treatment plan that will be effective and cost efficient. We need to encourage getting diagnosed in a facility that is run by professionals, not life coaches. This has been politicized as a largely classist take, as mental health professionals are not free. But actually, sometimes they are. Those who cannot afford mental health treatment often qualify for Medicaid, which renders diagnosis completely free. With as much information as there is about mental health on the internet, it seems like nobody recognizes how affordable it actually is. At the end of the day, mental health is a serious health science, just the same as physiological medicine. This is not a social issue, and discussing it in a way that has been politicized is counterproductive. Mental health professionals only want to see people get better. So let's stop villainizing those who spent their lives studying it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. So please leave a comment if there's anything that you disagreed with or anything that you just want to hear more about. Bye.